This is Ernie Alonzo with Haunted Orange County, and I'm here in Rochester, England, with Mr. Neil Arnold, who is author of Haunted Rochester. Neil, thanks for joining us.
No worries.
Tell us a little bit about the book and how you came about writing it.
Well, I live very local to here, and then I moved here about 7 or 8 years ago and realised that there was no real sort of people talking about the ghost stories when you consider it's got lots of Charles Dickens associations.
Okay.
Dickens, of course, wrote ghost stories, and I wanted to write about the macabre history. So one afternoon, I literally just walked up and down the high street, knocked on a few doors, and came back with well over 100 stories.
Wow.
Eventually turned it into a ghost walk and then the book, and that was it basically. Just
Awesome.
went from there.
We're standing in front of, or on the side of, Rochester Cathedral. How old is this structure here?
Well, there's different sort of dates on different parts, but if you consider the site behind it is actually Saxon ground, you're talking about going back to sort of the 600s.
Wow.
But of course, a lot of Britain goes back earlier than that as well with the Roman invasion. So we're talking about BC rather than AD. But of course, in general, Rochester, there's buildings going back to the 1200s. It's very, very old.
Wow. You're also known for another book that you wrote previous to this, correct? Called Monsters?
Monster, the A to Z of zooform phenomena.
Okay, and you were actually interviewed on Coast to Coast a few times.
That's right, I've been on
about the
Coast to Coast a few times discussing the book, which is more, I'm actually a monster hunter, which is quite an unusual job, but I go around the countryside investigating reports of strange creatures, but I'm also interested in the folklore and the culture of different creatures, especially creatures that don't really exist, but which have embedded themselves into our folklore. So I've covered stuff like the Jersey Devil and Mothman, which you've got in the United States, but the book also covers more obscure creatures from all over the world.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for agreeing to take us out tonight. So we're going to go ahead and start the little walk here and see what we can find.
Cool, let's go.
Come on.
I'm now standing in the moat of Rochester Castle, and there's lots of unusual stories around here. Now, Charles Dickens, before he died, he wanted to be buried somewhere in the castle moat, as symbolised on this plaque. Whoever buried him went against his wishes, so he was interred at Westminster Abbey. Now people believe that he haunts Rochester. Now, I don't really know anybody that's ever seen the ghost of Charles Dickens. People have seen very strange, shadowy figures in the moat. Now, this moat has never ever had any water in it. There used to be a house in the middle of it, which is very unusual. But what I did find when doing the Haunted Rochester book is that at least 500 plague victims were interred somewhere in this moat in unmarked graves, and witches that were executed elsewhere in Kent have also been buried under the castle walls. Also, around the 1800s, a man named Mr. Livingstone, he would go around of a daytime and he would often play bagpipes, and he would have a young boy that would go around afterwards and collect money like a busker. But in a drunken rage, Mr. Livingstone killed the little boy, and he was hanged on the other side of Rochester, and he was said to have been buried somewhere around the castle moat. So maybe it's him that is responsible for some of the shadowy figures that have been seen in this area. And we're actually standing outside what is believed to be the oldest pub in Kent, which means this could go back to 11, 12, 1300s. This is the Cooper's Arms, situated on St Margaret Street with Love Lane behind us. Now, if you actually go into the pub, which is now closed sadly, on the right hand side of the bar is a glass case, and in that glass case is a life-size model of a monk. And the story goes, in the 11-1200s, a local monk had an illicit affair with a local woman, and the Brotherhood was so unhappy they took him down into the cellar and they bricked him up alive. And they reckon he's responsible for the creaking floorboards, the shivers down the spine, the cold spots, the swaying tankards, but not many people have actually seen him. But there's actually a sign in the pub that says he always appears around November time. There is a guy that used to work there and used to stay the night, and he said that one night the front door was locked, so was the bedroom door, and you heard a banging on the actual door. And I said to him, "What did you do?" And he said, "I did what every brave man would do. I pulled the covers over my head and waited for the dawn to come." We're standing outside Eastgate House. This building, sadly at the moment, is under construction. Actually dates back to the 1500s. Used to be a museum. There was said to be the remains of a so-called monster in this building called the Bogman. It was actually the remains of a Neolithic warrior, and apparently the Bogman, one night the remains got up and left the building. It's a great scare story to sort of frighten children around campfire sort of fires. But also this building is said to be haunted by a woman in grey, who's often said to come down the main stairs. Some people say that a ghostly face can be seen looking out of one of the windows, but the trouble is nobody ever tells you what window it is, so it kind of ruins the story. But intriguingly, behind this building is a little pink building, and it's called Dickens's Swiss Chalet. Now, when he was very young, Charles Dickens used to sort of spend many a day walking up and down here. And of course, when he wrote his books, he would use Rochester in his books. And of course, Dickens wrote ghost stories. His most famous was Christmas Carol. But the pink building behind this building, he actually had this in his garden when he lived about 3 to 4 miles away at a little place called Higham. Apparently, when he died, they moved it here. And they reckon on certain nights of the year you can see the ghost of Charles Dickens peeping out of the shutters, and they reckon he will always be there until he finishes the unfinished extracts to the mystery of Edwin Drood. In other words, he's going to be there a long time because he never finished it anyway. We're actually standing outside an interesting building here. You'll notice around Rochester there's lots of little unusual stones that have been laid. This is actually a Baptist church in Rochester, but actually above it there's a very interesting stone which talks about Protestant martyrs of Rochester that were actually burnt alive in the sort of 1550s, so it's a long time ago, 500 years. There's also lots of cases in Kent and local to here of people literally being burnt alive at the stake because they was actually thought to be witches. We're standing outside of what is probably one of Rochester's most interesting buildings. This is Restoration House. Now, although it only goes back probably 1500s at most, it's got a lot of history. When Dickens wrote about this building, he actually used this as Satis House, but it's not. Satis House is on the other side of Rochester. There's quite a creepy ghost story. It actually says that around November time, the door of Restoration House comes open, and a woman holding a dead baby at her chest runs out of Restoration House, and she crosses into the vines, which is the old vineyard of the monks. Then a few seconds later she's followed by a monk. They literally go to Minor Canon Road and they vanish at a certain spot. Now, I don't know anybody that's actually seen this ghost, but it's like an anniversary sort of ghost. But people have actually said in the past this building is haunted. There's actually 2 chaps that live in this building at the moment. Over the years it's had more than 20 owners, including the local mayor, and he was actually involved in one of the strangest and silliest ghost stories. It was said that when the mayor actually lived here, his son, as a joke, got a flock of sheep and drove them into the house. The young boy was laughing, ran up the stairs, his dad hit him, he fell over the balcony and died. But it's the ghost of the sheep and not the boy said to haunt the building. We're standing at what's called College Gate. Quite a little weird area this, because what people don't realise is that somebody actually lives above us. And there's their front door. So their staircase goes up. Now, interestingly, in Edwin Drood, written by Dickens, this is known as Jasper's Gatehouse. It's also been called Church's Gate, but what I prefer is this one here, which is Cemetery Gate, because it leads to the actual cemetery further along. A few years ago, a lady was actually staying here one night. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and she heard the sound of horses' hooves, as if an old horse and cart or carriage was going up the high street. When she looked out the window, there was nothing there whatsoever. Many years ago, this would have been used as a very old coaching route for the old sort of horse and carriages going to and fro different villages, and of course they'd have been taking different belongings and objects and stuff like that. But like I say, it's also interesting, this is a crossroads. Many years ago it was believed that at crossroads the remains of witches that were burnt or possibly executed via stake were buried in these areas, and the reason they were staked was to stop them rising from the grave. This area here, there's quite a few ghost stories. This is City Books. Now City Books is owned by a chap called Bob, and his original bookshop was in the right building there, which is now a hair salon, a hairdresser's. They often used to report how books used to come off shelves and stuff like that, but it also happens in here. But one night the lady that works there, she walked home but couldn't find her door key, so she decided to spend the night in the shop. At 2 o'clock in the morning she settled down on the counter at the back of the shop, but she was awoken by the sound of somebody flicking through the pages of a book. She peeped over the counter and noticed at the end of the shop a woman in old-fashioned clothing flicking through the pages of a book. The ghostly figure turned to look at her, and it had no face. This is actually George Vault's. It's quite a cool lounge bar, nice place to drink. But what's really interesting is, to show how old Rochester is, underneath George Vault's there is a vault, hence the name George Vault's, and it's said to date back to 1325. Many years ago a couple got married in the vault, and they said they'd actually filmed on their wedding video a figure of a black monk. Other people claim that in the vault there's been like a black slimy mass going across the floor, and it goes up the wall and disappears. Other people have claimed to have actually seen a little girl lurking around the building. One lady reported actually sitting on the toilet and hearing the sound of a little girl outside the bathroom or toilet door. And that, believe me, that is the last thing you want to hear when you're sitting on the toilet. This is Baggins Bookshop, said to be England's largest second-hand bookshop. It's a maze of sort of old corridors, creaky floorboards, musty books. But what's interesting is that one of the flats upstairs is said to be haunted. A few years ago now, there was two guys and they was renting out a room together, and they started having stuff going missing, money, clothing was torn, and they started to blame each other. Eventually one of them was sick to death of having all these arguments that he moved out. The guy that was left, he reported that one night he could hear a dripping noise, but he couldn't locate it. The following night he heard the dripping noise again, and he noticed a chair in the corner of the room was dripping wet. A few nights after that he couldn't locate the actual leak. Then a few nights after that he heard the same dripping noise, woke up, and sitting on the chair was an old hag dressed all in black, rocking back and forward, mocking him. He was so terrified he left the building. Apparently they called in a psychic medium, and she claimed that the woman was said to be an old prostitute, a ghost, and the reason she was in the building was to ravage the two young men. This is the actual corn exchange here. If you actually look up, you can see what's called the moon-faced clock of the corn exchange. Brilliant story here. It's said that every Christmas Eve at midnight, the spectre of Charles Dickens appears somewhere on the spot on these cobbles. His apparition takes out his pocket watch and he sets it by the time of the clock above his head. I've known people who have stood on this spot for several hours at Christmas Eve at midnight, literally freezing to death, waiting for the ghost of Charles Dickens to appear, and he never does. I reckon alongside Dick Turpin and Anne Boleyn, Charles Dickens must be the most unreliable ghost on earth. We're actually standing now in what is known as the Vines, in other words the old vineyard. This was part of St Andrew's Priory. Now the monks, certainly going back to 11, 12, 1300s, they sort of make their wine or whatever from this vineyard. Now there was a lot more trees many years ago, but in 1987 they got knocked down in the storm. There also used to be a huge figure of a monk carved out of a tree. It was about 12 foot tall, but sadly the bark deteriorated and is now laying somewhere over there in the bushes. But the local school children used to say that on certain nights of the year the monk used to turn around, which was quite creepy. Now when I actually did the Rochester book, I didn't really have any good enough ghost stories from this area, only a vague description of Charles Dickens being seen, but I did actually find a really creepy story. It in which a lady claimed that a so-called vampire or some sort of figure haunts this area, and they reckon it basically takes the form of a very small being completely clad in black with two bright red glowing eyes. Now, it seems that this figure isn't your average sort of ghost, it's some type of weird elemental, it could be demonic, who knows, but it's actually been held responsible for attacking a few people in the area, scratching them and following them through this area, which at night can be quite eerie. But other than that, it's a very old area this, but I haven't got many other ghost stories apart from the so-called vampire.